Hi friends, welcome back to Locally Raised. Winter has come earlier than we expected, or than I expected this year. So yesterday we got a snow that actually stuck around a little bit till this morning, which by my memory is a little bit early for this area. So I still have a few heads of cabbage that I have been meaning to harvest and just haven't done it yet. Cabbage can withstand some frost, some snow, but it's not meant to sit out in sustained freezing temperatures. So I'm going to cut that cabbage this morning and we're going to ferment it. You'll notice I'm tossing aside some of the outer leaves. Normally I'd save those for cooking, but they're frozen pretty solid right now. This is my first year growing cabbage, so I've learned several lessons that will allow me to grow larger heads of cabbage next year. These heads I grew this year are fairly small. I will certainly start off with spraying BT for worms because I battled worms throughout the initial months of these growing. I'll also plant them in raised beds. I'll fertilize more heavily and I'll water more consistently. I've got 4 little cabbage heads. They're not enormous, but I think they're enough to give us some good sauerkraut and curtido. As I said, these heads are a little bit small, and I'm going to treat these 4 small heads as if they were 2 large heads. And we're going to make 2 recipes today. We're going to make sauerkraut, the classic fermented cabbage recipe, and then we're also going to make curtido, a Latin American sort of version of sauerkraut that I was just introduced to a couple months ago. So let's get these washed up. You can see these outer leaves are snowy and frosty. I'm so glad I'm not too late for these. They look like they're just fine. I was worried they might have been out in the frost for too long. This one's a little discolored. I think the frost was starting to bother it. But I peel back a layer and it looks pretty good. I'm going to start with quartering each cabbage and then cutting out that stem and slicing it as finely as I can. I've got all the cabbage cut, and this is what it's amounted to. So I'm going to just divide this roughly in half, and I'll use half for each recipe. I'm going to start with my sauerkraut. Sauerkraut is such a simple recipe. There are just 2 ingredients, cabbage and salt. And I'm going to use the most straightforward of recipes, which is to use the weight of each to determine amounts. So I'm going to weigh out my cabbage, and then however much cabbage I have, I'm going to use 2% of that weight in salt to add to the recipe. That amounts to 900 grams of cabbage, so now I'll add 18 grams of salt. All right. In this last step, the goal is just to draw the juices out of the cabbage by sort of breaking it down, kneading it or pounding it. This can be done by squeezing with your hands. It can be done with a wooden spoon that you tamp down. I'm gonna see if I can save myself time and try using my meat tenderizer, and I'm just going to pound this cabbage down and see if I can get its juices out. I've been working on this cabbage for about 10 minutes now, and it's really breaking down, but it's not releasing quite as much brine as I expected. I'm afraid my cabbage might have been a little dry from being overly mature. I'll show you what it looks like. If I give it a squeeze, you can see it releases a bit of moisture, but typically I would want to see some pools of brine or pools of juice released into the bottom of the bowl at this point, and I'm not. So I'm going to tamp this down into the jar and hope that as I'm tightly tamping it down, it releases enough moisture to cover itself. If not, I've looked up a few remedies online and we'll give them a try. I'm going to pack this cabbage into the jar as tightly as possible. I'm going to try using my mortar to really pack this down. I'm pretty pleased. As I tamped it in, I think there's just enough brine that I'll be able to keep the cabbage beneath the surface of the liquid. So I'll show you with my little pestle what we've got here. You can see that liquid coming out over the top. Now I'm going to use a fermentation weight to hold the cabbage beneath the surface of the liquid. Always with fermenting, the key is to get everything, all the substance below the line of the brine so that nothing molds and spoils. So I happen to have a fermentation weight. If you don't, that is not a problem. Anything that you can use that's roughly the size of the opening of your jar and will provide a little weight is great. So you could use a shot glass or any sort of little condiment bowl. Whatever you have on hand is good. I'll use my weight. Sort of push it down. You can see the juice rising around it, so that's great. Everything's going to be beneath it. And then I'm going to cover this. I've covered it very loosely. I'm not going to screw this on tight because this is going to start producing bubbles and releasing gas within a day or so. Because I've covered it, I'm going to have to burp it once a day. There are, fancier airlock seals that you can put on this to release air, but I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. So once a day I'll open this up and release gas, and then in about 2 weeks I'm gonna give it a taste and see if I like where it's at. I could let it ferment longer if I want more tang, or if I like where it's at in 2 weeks, I'll just put it into the fridge and this will be ready to go. This second fermented cabbage recipe that we're gonna make today is curtido, which is sort of like a Latin American sauerkraut. I tried it for the first time just a couple months ago. I was at a market that had a fermented veggie stand and they were giving out samples, and I was so curious because I'd never heard of curtido before. And as soon as I tasted it, it made me think that it's a combination of the two places that I've lived this year. So I've lived in Texas and in Pennsylvania. For me, the taste of sauerkraut takes me immediately to PA because it is a staple in PA Dutch fare. It's what the PA Dutch eat on New Year's. Pork and sauerkraut is the New Year's good luck food, and I grew up eating that every New Year's. And then it also has, Curtido also has jalapenos and cumin in it, or at least the kind I tried did. And that took me immediately to that flavor of Tex-Mex that I enjoyed in Texas. So I really like this flavor combination. And last night I happened to realize that one of my favorite books on food and nutrition, Nourishing Traditions, has a Curtido recipe. So that's what I'm going to be referring to today. I am tweaking the recipe a little bit to include those jalapenos and cumin because this recipe doesn't call for it, and it was in the version that I tasted and I really liked that. So let me show you our lineup of ingredients. Here's our head of cabbage. The recipe calls for 1 large shredded head. This is 2 of my small heads of cabbage shredded. And we've got a generous cup of shredded carrots that I shredded earlier today. 2 medium onions, finely diced. This is oregano from my garden, which feels good. So I'll just crush that up into the recipe. Jalapenos, here's where I'm deviating from the recipe in Nourishing Traditions. These are some finely diced pickled jalapenos. These are from my garden. I pickled these in a video a couple months ago, and they were on the hot end of the jalapeno spectrum, so I'm using just a small amount there. I'm gonna add in cumin, again, a deviation from the recipe. And then, of course, lacto-fermented dishes always use salt. It is important to stay away from iodized salt because that iodized salt can interfere with the fermentation process. So look for sea salt, Himalayan salt, kosher salt, something that's not iodized. I'm going to use the same bowl I used for the sauerkraut. Just going to crush that oregano into there. The recipe calls for a tablespoon. I'm going to crush a little bit more. Oh, that really releases a good smell. I'm going to start with just a teaspoon of cumin and see if I like how that tastes. And then I'll use 2 tablespoons of salt. Just like last time, I'll combine with my hands to evenly distribute all those seasonings, and then I'll work it with the meat grinder. I packed my sauerkraut into a quart-sized jar, and it was a little tight. The Curtido, there's more mixture, so I'm packing this into a 2-quart jar, or a half-gallon jar. One distinction between Curtido and sauerkraut that I forgot to mention earlier is that Curtido does not ferment for as long as sauerkraut. So on the spectrum of pickled to fermented, Curtido is a little more towards the pickled end. This will be allowed to sit on the counter for 3 days, and then I'll probably put it in the fridge and slow down that fermentation process to lock in the flavor. Because my fermentation weight is much smaller than this jar, I'm going to start with some cling wrap It's an awkward process, but if I can spread it across the surface and try to seal in that fluid, then I can use my fermentation weight to hold it down. All right, we've got our curtido and our sauerkraut. So like I said, this one I'll check on in about 3 days. And if the flavor is good, that'll be time to put it in the fridge. This will be more like 2 weeks. And again, I can check the flavor, put it in the fridge when it's where I like it. I'm glad this one will be ready sooner so we can start working on that until this one's ready. Traditionally, this is used on pupusas. That's not a part of my family's diet, so we'll probably eat it as a condiment on tacos. And we might also have it with sausages and hot dogs and things like that. Sauerkraut we would have on sausages and hot dogs as well. Thanks for joining me to harvest and process my cabbage. I'll put the recipes down in the box below, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.